All right, everybody, welcome to the last video of the semester. So we're going to finish up chapter 12, which is exercise in the cold. And then we're going to, excuse me, we're going to finish off with chapter 13, which is going to be exercising at altitude. So let's get started. So who has to worry about the cold? Hikers, hunters, outside workers, athletes. What about everyone else? I mean, yes, everybody has to worry about the cold. And when we talk about exercise, we don't just mean, athletes that are participating in sport outdoor or outside in the cold. You think about it, hunting is a very big culture and it deals with the cold. Yes, I know, we put on different types of clothing for that, but it all is the same kind of concept. You're still having to walk up a mountainside or through a field or through the woods, carrying the animal, so on and so forth. It all counts as exercise. Hikers the same way. What about when you're hiking? It may be warm down at the basin, but as you ascend, it's going to get cooler, and then the atmosphere is going to change. So everything, we don't just look at it as pure just athletes, okay? Cold injuries, though, are less common than heat injuries, mainly because we prepare better for the cold than we do the heat, just because, I mean, let's think about it this way. If you're going out to work out in the heat or even just outside to hang outside, there's a difference between wearing a t-shirt versus a no t-shirt, right? On how much sun hits the body and everything else. So we don't really prepare as much, and we don't think about preparing for the heat because we think, oh, well, we'll just wear less clothing. Well, the cold is a little different. We're always wanting to bundle up, right? So we're typically a little bit more prepared. We know what's happening. But it is detrimental to work and performance as well. So how we talk about heat loss, body composition affects your heat loss. So that if there's increase in inactive peripheral muscle, that means that there's also an increase in insulation. Meaning, if you don't have a lot of peripheral muscle on the legs, arms, stuff like that, odds are you probably have an increase in fat deposit. You're probably overweight or obese. If you increase, which is going to help increase fat a little bit, or insulation. Increase in subcutaneous fat equals an increase in insulation. Decrease your body surface area to mass ratio, you're going to decrease heat loss. Men versus women. Women have more subcutaneous fat, which is an advantage, but typically less active muscle, which is a disadvantage. True difference in cold tolerance is minimal, okay? But the fact that men have more muscle mass, we typically handle the cold a little better than females do. So what's our response to the cold? One is shivering thermogenesis. Basically, the temperature of the skin cools rapidly and the core temperature falls. Quick cycling of contraction, relaxation, it's involuntary, meaning your body is signaling to itself that it needs to contract and relax those muscles to produce heat. Remember, we talked about as we are exercising, or as that muscle's contracting, we're creating heat. So in an effort to, control the body temperature and warm up, we have shivering thermogenesis. That's no mechanical work or energy is converted to heat. Everything is being utilized at that point in time. Vasoconstriction at the peripheries, so we conserve our body heat, keeps blood flow away from the skin. Heat loss is reduced to the fat mass, insulation of the blood vessels. So when I say that we have a vasoconstriction of the periphery or the peripheral, what is the part of the body that you think gets, or what parts of the body do you think get cold first? Fingers, toes, hands, feet, arms, legs, right? That's because we're starting to vasoconstrict the periphery. The body knows that, you know what, if we lose a finger, we lose a hand, whatever, we're fine. We cannot stand to lose any type of blood flow or warmth to the core. where all the internal organs are. We also have non-shivering thermogenesis. This is more of an increase in metabolism. Epinephrine and norepinephrine increase your metabolism, that heat production without ATP production. Young adults versus old adults. Have you ever realized, and you probably don't, but just kind of think back on or watch, kids seem to never be cold, right? Put a jacket on. No, I don't want to. And they're fine. Basically, they have an increased metabolism. Their heart rate's a lot faster pace. It's not that big of a deal to them. But when you look at older adults, it could be 85, 90 degrees and they're still wearing a sweater, right? Because they're cold. Their metabolism is lower. Therefore, they don't have that heat production anymore. So how does it start to decrease our performance? Well, one of them is the manual function. Dexterity, progressively diminished functions. So your fingers, think about when your fingers get cold, it's harder to move them or do fine motor skill type of movements with your hands. The large surface area to the volume equals convective heat loss. Low muscle and low fat mass means little insulation and little heat generation. I mean, even if you think about it, barring you being severely obese, your hands and your feet are typically very lean in nature, right? They don't have a lot of fat. They don't have a lot of muscle. So therefore, they will get cold faster. And when we start to shunt the blood to the core, they're the worst, or not the worst, but they are the first to get the blockade away, meaning they're not getting as much blood flow anymore to begin with. But if you think about what type of sports or exercises require high dexterity, archery, hunting, anything that might deal with grabbing something or climbing, right? You want to make sure that you're doing things. So hiking, hunting, all that, to archery, all of that is going to be types of sports that could run the risk. So when we talk about cold acclimatization, there's very inconclusive studies, meaning that we don't really think that we get acclimatized to the cold. A lot of this is potentially due to a blunting of the shivering and the vasoconstriction aspects, meaning so individuals that are more likely to spend more time in the colder areas, maybe where they live and their overall environment, their bodies may have a little bit of an adaptation that allows for the vasoconstriction and the shivering to be, I guess what you'd say, delayed, or at least reset a little bit. But overall, we don't have, we can't sit there and say that if we go out there and we progressively wear less and less clothing like we do for the heat, where we say in about 2 weeks you're acclimatized, there's no acclimatization to the cold. Behavioral thermoregulation. A lot of that could be our clothing, warm drinks, physical activity, shelter. All that keeps us thermoregulated and warm and keeps us sheltered from the cold. We also have the thermic effect of food. So that in and of itself is going to increase body temperature. If you've ever heard of something called the meat sweats, meat or protein, if you get enough of it, basically it's so hard to break down, or it requires so much energy to break down, that it will start to create more body heat. Or any types of foods that may be spicy will produce a increase in thermoregulation, an increase in body heat. And then different insulative properties. So performance, again, cooling a muscle decreases the contraction and the force of speed. Large, deep muscles will rarely ever experience this. So the musculature that's deeper within the body, not as superficial, won't really ever have an issue. It's going to be more of our superficial muscle layers that will have an issue with the cold and will decrease force and speed. Moving your hand when it's cold, for instance, okay, that's a good example of this. It's very hard, or you think that you're trying real hard to close it and it closes real slowly. That contraction force and speed has decreased because of the cold. Proper insulation, there's no impairment of performance. So uh, we have made strides in clothing, obviously with Under Armour, Nike, and so on and so forth, where we have clothing that is able to insulate us uh, in the cold and keep us warm without decreasing performance. I mean, think about it right now. You could go out and play in a very cold weather game and be wearing just another, what almost looks like a thin layer like this to keep warm, instead of having to wear like a massive poofy jacket and all that. That's going to decrease range of motion and performance. As intensity increases, you will see a decrease in shivering. Well, again, that's because you're now starting to produce heat, so you're no longer having to shiver. You're kind of you're creating that heat on its own by your physical activity. We'll see a decrease in that vasoconstriction. So once again, because we are keeping up heat production, it will allow for those to vasodilate a little bit. So we still get remaining blood flow to the outer areas, the periphery. And heat loss will occur while trying to conserve that heat. So when we look at it, what about prolonged exercise? There's increase to fatigue, mainly because we have a decrease in the heat production. Lower core temperatures increase that rate of fatigue. It's a continuous cycle, okay? Once again, you got to think about it this way. After a certain point, all this, as we've increased our intensity, we can only increase it to a certain extent before we are working at such a high intensity that we can't prolong the exercise, right? How do we prolong exercise? We decrease that intensity to continue going. Well, if we do that, we start to, reverse some of these other actions that we've done. So now, because we have that lower core temperatures, we have increased the rate of fatigue, because now we're going to have to start shunting blood away from the periphery and into the core. Well, if we do that, now less blood is getting to the working muscles, right? Free fatty acid use for exercise, that vasoconstrictions inhibits the ability to reach fat. So if we're decreasing our ability to reach fat for fuel, well, we're really never going to get to that point, where we're very oxidative in nature, right? So we're still working on glucose and glycogen stores. And remember, we have a very limited tank for that aspect. So if we burn through that real quick and we can't reach the fat for fuel, we're going to fatigue very quickly. So we talked about heat injuries or heat illnesses. Let's talk about some cold injuries. Just as an FYI, there are some pictures in here, so just be prepared, okay? I'll try not to stay on them very long. We have hypothermia. So this will happen whenever it's 95 to 96 degrees, can occur in any season or any climate. Essentially, below 31, shivering will stop, progressive loss of involuntary function thereafter. If we reach 20 degrees Celsius, we will see a loss of cardiac function. So hypothermia is not a good thing. When we re-warm somebody, we would use a sleeping bag, clothing, radiant heat, external heat sources like a heat lamp, for instance, or warm fluids. But you want to make sure that that warms up gradually. You don't want to put them into a vastly hot tub of water for fear of burn or any types of other nerve damages that could occur. We also have frostbite. That's when you have a low temperature, air temperature, plus low blood flow. So like I said, we've moved away from using the periphery, so we've reduced blood flow. That means that there's a lack of oxygen to those tissues. The entire skin and blood vessels become damaged. Black masses form. We start to see mummification essentially is happening. Gangrene, which is infection, and it'll spread very quickly. and it basically kills off muscle and bone. And anywhere you see that, you're going to have to start cutting or amputating above that mark. So it's not just, cut the toe, it's probably cutting off the ankle at that point, or cutting all the toes off at that point in time. When you're rewarming them, or somebody that may have frostbite, clothing, warm liquids, and warm water immersion is helpful. Extreme pain is associated with rewarming frostbite. It's unintentional, it's unavoidable if getting to safety. That warm water, you want to keep it, you are running a risk of burns if you get it too hot. Think about it this way. How many of you have ever worn no gloves out in very freezing cold air temperature, got into the car that's been running, and you put your hands right on blowing hot water or hot air? That kind of stinging feeling? That's going to essentially be what's happening. So that was exercise in the cold. That was cold injuries that can occur. That is chapter 12, heat and cold. So last little thing that's kind of environmental, let's talk a little bit about altitude. We're going to talk about environmental conditions at altitude, our physiological response to it, exercise and performance, how do we adapt, and what are some of the health risks that are involved with altitude. So what is altitude? Atmospheric pressure, there's the same percentage of oxygen, CO2, and nitrogen. It's just excuse me, it's a lower partial pressure of those three, and that's Boyle's law. Essentially what's happening is, as you can see, we still have the same percentage of the air and oxygen and whatnot, but look at what's happening. The partial pressure continues to go down as we go up. Oops, let me move myself here. So if we look at it, we're going at Miami, which is at sea level, obviously. And as you progress higher and higher and higher, look, still the same percentage, okay? But why do you think partial pressure is down? Well, look at the barometric pressure. 760, 631, 585, 430, 253, okay? That's what's causing that decrease in partial pressure. Remember, how does our oxygen flow through the system? It moves through partial pressure. So we can have hypoxia, which is the partial pressure of oxygen, and hypoxemia, which is in the blood. Hypoxia is just the overall changes in partial pressure of oxygen. Hypoxemia is when we start to see it in the blood. Normoxia, and that's low, obviously, low partial pressure. Normoxia is at sea level. It's normal breathing conditions. Hyperoxia is a higher partial pressure of oxygen. Where do you think we would see that? If going up gives us a lower partial pressure, where do we think that we're going to see a higher partial pressure? Going below sea level, descending, right? That's why if you don't properly breathe your tank or whatever, and you come up too fast, you will start to see the bends, the air bubbles, and stuff like that occur within the system. Or if you have a decrease and you're not properly, the equipment's not properly done, it'll crush it like a can down at way deeper depths of the sea, like submarines and stuff like that. It can. That's what we're basically talking about there. So when we start talking about that, the partial pressure is changing. This is a picture that should look familiar. This is the picture that we had in chapter 7. Okay. Look, 100 to 100, we're moving. Remember all this, right? We're moving oxygens out of the blood. That's why now it's at 40, right? So that's normal. That's at sea level. Oh, the explanation must come, or the picture may come here in just a second. Sorry. So how does this affect performance? What we see is that it is actually, there's a short-term anaerobic performance. The lower partial pressure of oxygen generally has little effect. Why? Because when we're anaerobic, we're not worried about the amount of oxygen that we're getting to the system, right? That lower air resistance, however, could improve performance. So whenever somebody says that air is thin in the mountains, that's what they mean. It means that it's little lower air resistance. Long-term aerobic performance, that lower partial pressure will start to affect performance. So what really happened, what was really cool, was that we had these back-to-back Olympic Games, and these back-to-back Olympic Games really changed our outlook and research efforts and whatnot in our training in regards to how does altitude and environment affect performance. So if you know anything about geography, Tokyo is an island. Or not Tokyo, it's not. Japan is an island, but Tokyo's on Japan. And it's an island, so it's at sea level, right? Mexico City, if you go back, is at altitude. It's actually higher than Denver, okay? Now let's start looking at this. So short races for men, it's 100 meters, like I said. So we're looking at a lot of stuff that is anaerobic in nature. We really didn't see a lot. Not a lot of change between Tokyo and Mexico City, right? Maybe a little bit faster, just a little bit. At Mexico City could be the lower air resistance, right? So in that case, we didn't really see much happening. But look at what happens at, for women, same thing. Not much of a difference, right? These are short term. These are all anaerobic in nature. Now let's look at longer races. Look at Tokyo. All of a sudden, it took us longer to run in Tokyo than it did in Mexico City. 1,500 meters. Still, it's a mile, so we haven't really seen much happen there, okay? Still kind of anaerobic in nature, but it's considered a long race, right? Because you can run a mile in a kind of a sprinting pace, right? Now let's look at what happens when we move it up to almost the 2-mile mark. Suddenly, we are now 21 seconds slower. We are 15 to 20 seconds slower at 5,000. We're a minute longer or slower, right? Marathon, 8 minutes slower. The other one, 9 minutes slower. Why do you think that is? Okay, we're about to explain that. I'm going to tell you why. A lot of that is because we have a decrease in our VO2 max at altitude. Why? Remember what VO2 max is. It's your cardiac output times your AVO2 difference. So heart rate max and stroke volume max remain relatively unchanged, meaning the heart's still going to work as hard as the heart's going to work, right? So in reality, when we go to altitude, our cardiac output doesn't change very much. The major factor is our oxygen extraction. That low partial pressure of oxygen causes a lower alveolar PO2, which means that we're going to have a decrease in the saturation. Okay, so you can look at this right here. Look at that, okay? You can see the percent of maximal aerobic power measured at sea level and at altitude, okay? So if we're looking at it, if we're looking at their power, their VO2 max at sea level, this is it. So if we were at sea level, you should be, basically, we could put a dot right here. All right, that means that it's 100%. So whatever that might be, whatever it is, 60 VO2, that's 100% for this graph. Look what starts to happen. At Mexico City, which is at altitude, we start to see where we can only reach up to maybe 90% of it. Go a little higher. We can only reach up to 80%. The higher we go, the lower percentage that we can reach, right? Meaning, if we're working at our hardest, that's as high as we're going to go. So this is the picture. This one right here on the left would be one that would translate very well to what we talked about in chapter 7. Okay, looks exactly the same, right? 100, 100, moves in. Now all of a sudden we're at 40, right? We've unloaded. This is the exercise. Look what happens over here at altitude. Wow. We've already decreased the amount of partial pressure of oxygen, right? From 100 to 42. Okay, that shouldn't be a big problem. But look what starts to happen. When we get down here, there's only a shift of what, 15? Look at the shift at sea level. We're offloading more oxygen down here at sea level. At altitude, we can't diffuse that much. We can't offload it. So what does that mean? That means that there's less oxygen able to go to the working muscles. There's less oxygen for them to pull from, right? So that's what's going to happen short term. Heart rate and your ventilation. That heart rate is going to actually increase. You're working a little harder, okay, at altitude than you are at sea level. Your ventilation, you're breathing heavier, okay? Why do you think you're breathing heavier? Because you're trying to get more oxygen in to work to the working muscles, right? So it's not necessarily that you're working harder. It's the fact that because there's less partial pressure of oxygen up there, you're able to offload less. You're trying to breathe in more to try to offset that. So how do we acclimatize ourselves to altitude? Well, there's a scenario, there's a statement. It's called live high, train low. Essentially, if you are to live high, live at the altitude, we start to see an increase in your red blood cell production. This is called polycythemia. And you start to see it more after 6 months. So, I mean, you have to live there for an extended period. What's happening is erythropoietin, or EPO, is being released. That's helping increase your amount of red blood cells. And that, in fact, is going to counteract that lower PO2, meaning we're going to put more red blood cells out there, which means that the amount of oxygen we're going to get more red blood cells through there to load more oxygen. So we're kind of starting to offset things, right? But it's important to stay hydrated or that won't work. Now, with that being said, we also see an improved saturation of oxygen, increase in the blood flow to the lungs. We start to see an increase in your respiration, vascular endothelial growth factors, nitric oxide production. So we're going to get vasodilation more occurring, increase in our plasma volume. Well, what happens when we do that? If we increase our plasma volume, that's the offset for that increase in red blood cells. So we don't make our blood as viscous, right? We want it to be thin so it's easier to flow, so we're not overworking the heart. Now, this right here is essentially what individuals who are trying to blood dope are trying to do in a short-term amount of time. When we take the blood out, we spin it down, we extract your red blood cells, and then we essentially inject those red blood cells back. So we have essentially done this up here, right, in the matter of 1 day. All right, which what's going to happen is it's going to help improve your VO2 max and your oxygen utilization. That's what this up here is doing. Here's the problem. This takes 6 months. And in that 6 months, your body is also doing this down here to help improve that saturation, increasing that plasma volume. When we blood dope, when we just inject the red blood cells back in, there's no increase in plasma volume. So now you have made your blood more viscous. That's why it's a dangerous game to play. But if you see a lot of aerobically trained individuals, I'll take one for instance. I know the backlash of his cheating, but he was very physiologically gifted on the bike. Lance Armstrong. He had a house in Colorado. That's where he typically lived. And whenever it started to come down to training time, he would move down to Austin, and he would ride I-35 from Austin to Dallas and Waco all the time. Why? Texas is basically at sea level. So he would get the benefits of living up in the altitude and training, and then he'd come and compete down here at sea level. And what's that going to do? You're going to be way more improved when you come down to sea level. So some of the injuries or illnesses that are associated with altitude, we have acute mountain sickness. So this is AMS, onset anywhere between 6 to 48 hours after the arrival. And it's most severe from day 2 to day 3. Upon arrival, you'll see that you have a headache, nausea and vomiting, dyspnea, so shortness of breath, insomnia. You're going to need a gradual ascent to altitude to kind of avoid that. Well, what's the problem? Acute mountain sickness is something that can be individuals that have it all the time. You could get it right now if you were to fly up there. Why? Because you kind of quickly got up to elevation, right? And you didn't, and when the plane landed, it didn't come down as far. So you are prone to possible acute mountain sickness. Possible causes: low ventilator response to the altitude, CO2 accumulates, and we start to see acidosis occur. Headache is the most common symptom, mostly experienced over 3,600 meters. It's continuous and throbbing, worse in the morning and after exercise. Essentially what's happening is we see a low partial pressure of oxygen within the air and the blood. Hypoxia, cerebral vasodilation occurs, which is stretching those pain receptors in the brain. That's what's causing that throbbing headache. Then we have HAPE, high altitude pulmonary edema. It's accumulation of fluid in the lungs, likely related to hypoxic pulmonary vasoconstriction. We'll start to see clot formation in pulmonary circulation, causes cells to begin to leak. That's not a good thing. Some of the symptoms are shortness of breath, cough, tightness, fatigue. We'll see a decrease in your blood oxygen. Confusion will set in, and unconsciousness can occur. Treatment: supplemental oxygen. Immediate descent to a lower altitude. So what we're going to do is we're going to infuse them with supplemental oxygen, so like the oxygen mask, and then we need to slowly get them from the altitude back down to lower altitude. So we have that. Can you think of anything that could be similar in reverse altitude or below sea level, right? The bends, okay? If you ascend too fast, it's a problem. HACE, or high altitude cerebral edema. Some of the causes: complication of HAPE, so anything above 4,300 meters, edemic pressure buildup in the intracranial spaces, and we'll start to see cranial leakage. Not a good thing. Some of the symptoms: confusion, lethargy, ataxia, unconsciousness, death can occur with high altitude cerebral edema. Again, we're going to treat with supplemental oxygen, a hyperbaric bag, and immediate descent to a lower altitude. And we don't want it to be a fast descent. As much as this sounds like it is an emergency case to get down fast, trust me, you're going to do more damage if you descend fast than if you just descend at a normal rate. Okay? All right, guys. So that's spring 2020. It's the last video. Please be on the lookout for emails regarding the final, what the requirements, time limits, time, date, so on and so forth are of the finals. Get your labs turned in next week. And if you need anything, email. I'd be happy to Zoom call and go over some information with y'all. So whatever y'all need, let me know. Thanks for working with me over the last little bit of the semester for this, and let's finish off strong. Have a good day.